Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us for what we hope to be will be a very interesting exchange. Studying mysticism is apparently quite stimulating, that we all know, and a cross study of two mystic luminaries should be even more. So that's the idea that inspired this evening, this gathering, to do a cross reading, a comparative reading of two, in a way, distinct and in a way, as we might discover, very similar luminaries that interpreted their traditions in very innovative ways with lasting legacies. I hope this to be a very interesting exchange, and thanks to our speakers for joining us this evening. And the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, because Rumi is chronologically the predecessor of Swedenborg, I shall go first since I'm speaking about Rumi. But I thought I would set the stage, as it were, by making a few comments, first of all, about what mysticism is and how it evolves in the Muslim tradition so that it arrives at Rumi in the 13th century. Mysticism, I think, can be viewed as an intense subset of religion, and religion is all about tying us back to the source that we believe has made us. The very word religio in Latin means a binding back. So we're seeking to be bound back to that source for the obvious reason. It has the power, having created us, to destroy us. It can help us, harm us, hinder us, further us. It can bless us, it can curse us. We want the positive side of that ledger, and so we seek to be in contact with it, to be connected to it, and that's the point and purpose of religion. Along comes mysticism at a certain time, it would seem to be in most every tradition, which, again, based on the word itself, mysticism coming from a Greek verb, not Latin but Greek, mystein, which means to close or by extension to hide. So the mysterion is the hiddenness of God. And the mystic believes that garden variety practitioners of religio don't access that hiddenmost part of God, and that's what the mystic seeks to do. Or put another way, the mystic seeks to be filled with God. If I am to be filled with God, I've got to empty myself of self. And that means that there are both challenges and dangers to the mystical enterprise. The challenge, of course, is, can I somehow access the mysterium? If I succeed, can I get back from that? If I succeed, can I express what was clearly an experience beyond words, an ineffable experience, to those around me? And if I can't, it could be dangerous. Al-Hallaj in 922 came out of this mystical experience yelling, "I am the truth, Ana al-Haq," one of the names of God, and they thought he was simply being heretical and executed him. But of course, it wasn't that he was heretical, it's that he couldn't get God outside of himself and distinguish himself from God any longer. So he was speaking, as it were, God's words out of his own mouth. The challenge, therefore, to get there, to get back, to express it, the danger is that you can't get back and you go mad, or you drop dead, or you apostatize. So often mainstream religious leaders are opposed to the mystical enterprise because they're concerned that individuals will get engaged in ways that are beyond them and be torn apart by it. In the Muslim tradition, Muhammad dies in 632, and within a century, there is already developing a mystical movement. It first emphasizes the awesome qualities of God. The first notable woman, Rabia, redirects Muslim mysticism away from awe to love, the loving God and the intense love of God. And the name that comes to attach itself to the Muslim mystical tradition, as you may know, is Sufism, probably from the Arabic word suf, which refers to the material. It's a kind of plain woolen wrapper, as it were. And it became common for Sufis to attire themselves that way so as to suggest their disconnection from concerns for the world, and everybody wanted to wear pretty clothes and nice jewelry and what have you. We only wear plain, very plain woolen garments. And it's within that tradition that Rumi enters the historical scene born in 1207 in Balkh, which is actually in what is today Afghanistan. So in the course of his life, he would spend a good deal of time in what we now call Iran, and the language of culture for that part of the Muslim world was in any case Persian, so that would have been the language he would have used at a certain point. But he ended up in Konya, in what is now Turkey, and the other language in which he would write was Turkish. So the Turks and the Persians both claim him, but actually he's an Afghani. So they have a right to claim him as well. That's where he was born in 1207. However, Balkh was invaded about 15 years later, no less, 12 years later, in 1219, by the Mongols. And tradition has it, I wasn't there so I can't verify this for sure, that his mother was killed in the Mongol invasion. In any case, it was he and his father who fled Balkh, and they traveled through much of the Muslim world, including going on Hajj to Mecca and to Medina, and ultimately ending up in Konya. But along the way, every time and every place they stopped, his father was a renowned master of jurisprudence, of Sharia. And Mr. Mucky Muck, the biggest guy in town, would say, look, let me build you a house, or come stay with me, or I'll build you a school. And his father would say, no, I just want to stay with the people. And Rumi was being trained to follow in his father's footsteps as a master of jurisprudence, as a legalist. And that's what he began to teach in his father's footsteps. And one day, tradition would have it, was the year 1244. So do the math, he was 36, 37 years old. This guy by the name of Shams from Damascus shows up in his classroom and asks him whether Muhammad or a very renowned Sufi was a better Muslim, closer to God. And Rumi was kind of nonplussed by that, because your automatic knee-jerk reaction is the perfect man is Muhammad, the seal of the prophets. But this guy is a renowned mystic, which means he's gained access to the mysterion, and he was completely flummoxed. And from that day forward, two things happened. First of all, Shams and he became inseparable. But second of all, he began to redirect himself from the concern for the legal side of Islam to its mystical side. As Islam spread over the centuries, as within it Sufism spread across the centuries, it spread across geography. And in different parts of the Muslim world, different orders, the word in Arabic is tariqah, so different places would have different tariqahs that reflected particulars of the culture or of the thinking of that part of the world, that language, that ethnicity, under the roof of Islam, under the roof of Sufism, but with particular particulars. But every Sufi order had in common with every other Sufi order certain things that everybody did. So in order to begin the engagement with God, the process would go by two names, really. The broader name is dhikr. Dhikr comes from it is an Arabic word, an Arabic root meaning memory. So it is as if in this moment I completely focus my energy to remember that God is all around me, to remember that God is within me, and to remember that I'm trying to seek to bring all of that even more intensely to bear. Typically, the actual instrumentation of initiating the dhikr is called a sama, which comes from the Arabic root for hearing. So some sort of a word or some sort of a phrase. And most typically what I would do is to repeat that word or repeat that phrase again and again and again and again and again and again and again. And what is the point and purpose of that? Because words as I ordinarily use them in the everyday sense make sense in a certain sense to us, to me. But if I repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat in a while, it becomes nonsense syllables. And that's the whole point, nonsense. Because I want to transcend my senses. I want to transcend not only my physical senses, but even my mental senses, my normal intellectual manner of dealing with the world, or even my non-intellectual, my emotional, my psychological manner. I want to transcend all of that. And the sama is the way in. One of the unique features of the tariqah that is associated with Rumi, however, is that it followed not a verbal but an entirely physical route into the process of engaging the mysterium. So the story is, and again I wasn't there so I can't attest to the absolute veracity of the story, is that when Rumi began to shift away from a purely jurisprudential, legalistic way of thinking and studying and teaching, and became more and more interested in the mystical side of Islam, that his style of teaching also changed. And he more and more started to jump around as he'd speak, and you can imagine he lost a lot of students. He also gained students who were fascinated and attracted to the path that he was taking. In fact, Soltes at some point would disappear. He was relocated, he came back into Rumi's life, and he disappeared a second time, never to be seen again. And the rumor is that it was actually Rumi's son who arranged for the murder of Shams because he was jealous of the tight relationship that Shams had with his father. But Rumi found one person after another to become his connected to the world by recording the kinds of things that he was saying, the kinds of things that he was teaching. Kind of like Socrates or like Muhammad or like Jesus. They weren't writing things down themselves, others wrote it down, and the same is true of Rumi. So Rumi's tariqa begins its process, its sema, with what may have been an outgrowth of the way in which he started to dance when he was teaching and spin when he was teaching. So the Mehlava tariqa typically whirls. So everyone has heard of the whirling dervishes. That's who they are. They follow in Rumi's footsteps. And they're not just whirling. A group of them will be spinning on one leg again and again, but they're also moving as if they're a series of planets, moving around the sun, except there's nothing in the center. There's no thing in the center. God is in the center. There's no sun. And they move with their heads tilted at just an angle. And the angle, I've never measured it, but I've been told is precisely 23.5 degrees, which is the angle of the Earth's tilt on its axis. And that may account for the fact that they spin and they spin and they spin and they spin, and any ballerina would be jealous of the amount of time they continue to spin with their eyes closed so they're not pointing, spinning without getting dizzy. They start on a dime, they stop on a dime. They're wearing a long flowing garment that is tended to suggest a shroud, so as to keep ever present in their mind that our living path is a bridge between where we were before and where we will go after. And the before and after is a connection to God, which is ultimately what we seek. Their headgear is intended to suggest a gravestone with the same sort of symbolic idea. And ultimately, what evolves with his tariqa is a whole set of music that comes to accompany the dance, particularly the flute that becomes a symbol for the human. So we are like a reed flute, this carapace that is ultimately empty, except when you blow into it, it makes these beautiful notes, it makes these beautiful sounds. So the idea, of course, is that the soul that is breathed into us is what makes us make beautiful notes, beautiful sounds, at least when they're beautiful, I suppose. But Rumi ultimately, of course, would become best known to subsequent generations who study him for the enormous volume of prose and poetry that is associated with him, recorded by Shams and others over the course of his life. He died in 1273. And one of the more significant, I think, features of Rumi's writing is the way in which it reflects what ultimately mysticism does for the mystic and the mystical community. And that is the following. Religion, to come back to where I began, has as its point and purpose to connect us to that which we believe has made us. But alas, over the course of the history of religion, as often as not, perhaps more often than not, the human ego has interceded within the functioning of religion, so that I begin to believe that there's only one correct route to the one God, and that's mine. Or if you're part of my community, ours. And those of you who don't agree with my understanding or our understanding are that other that at best we tolerate, at worst we try to oppress, and even worse we try to destroy. So the history of religion, and certainly the era of Rumi, the 12th century, that's the second half of the Crusades. That's the Mongol invasions. That's all this violence, not all of it because, but much of it because of religion. For the mystic, none of that makes sense. If I empty myself of self, one of the things it turns out that I'm likely to find out is that that kind of a conviction that there's only one correct path to oneness with the one is not God speaking. It's not the mysterion speaking, it's my ego speaking. I can still be as intense a Muslim or a Jew or a Christian as I was as a non-mystic, but the key difference is my capacity to recognize that others who have found a different path, a different shar, to use the root of that word sharia, a different path to the mysterion, can be as much on the right path as I am, because as much as my path is perfect for me, other paths can be perfect for others. So that connects to a sense of God everywhere and in everything that can be accessed from everywhere and anywhere by different paths. The proper term in English for that is panentheism or panhenotheism, not pantheism, not everything around us is gods, trees and streams and what have you. But heno is the Greek word for one, theos is God, the one God, pan, in everything. I recognize God in everything and everywhere. So I'll just share with you 3 or 4 passages, a couple in prose and a couple in poetry, that are associated with Rumi's writings to give you a sense of what I think he has a sense of. So this is a passage in prose, from the 6th volume of his extensive work called the Masnavi, and it reads in part like this. It's actually lines 3172 through 3178 for those of you who are still stuck on, academic details. I see you all being very academic out there. Think of all creatures as pure and clear water, reflecting the attributes of God. Every creature possesses something of the knowledge, justice, and kindness of God. They are the stars in the night sky, reflecting in flowing water. A good king reflects the power of God. A good scholar reflects the knowledge of God. Generations come and go, and each generation is a new generation, reflecting the divine attributes in a new way. Yet the attributes themselves do not change. Justice is the same justice, and knowledge the same knowledge. So this is not the words of someone who only thinks of Islam, or if he were of a different faith, only thinks of Judaism, or only thinks of Christianity, or only thinks of this or that form of faith as the way in which to seek and find God. On the contrary, there are an infinite number of ways. He writes elsewhere, also in the Masnavi, however, we are the mirror as well as the face in it. We are tasting the taste this minute of eternity. We are pain and what cures pain, both. We are the sweet cold water and the jar that pours. That's a beautifully metaphorical way, of course, describing of what the mystic becomes when the mystic emptied of self becomes filled with God. The mystic is the lover seeking God who is the beloved. God is the lover seeking the mystic who is the beloved. The beloved and the lover and love, those 3 elements become indistinguishable. They become triune. They become one. And so the mirror and we and the face in it become one. And the jar that pours and the cold water are one. 2 more passages, if you'll indulge me. If you'll indulge Rumi. Forget me. This is also from the Masnavi, but this is from the poetry part, but it's a brief couplet. Every holy person seems to have a different doctrine and practice, but there's really only one work. And my favorite, which I will read in more of its entirety, is this one. because it is the voice of God speaking through the mystic. It's not the mystic merely speaking for himself. Not Christian or Jew or Muslim nor Hindu, Buddhist or Sufi or Zen, not any religion or cultural system. I am not from the East or the West, not out of the ocean or up from the ground, not natural or ethereal, not composed of elements at all. I do not exist, am not an entity in this world or the next, did not descend from Adam and Eve or any origin story. My place is placeless, a trace of the traceless, neither body or soul. I belong to the beloved, having seen the two worlds as one, and that one call to a no, first, last, outer, inner, only that breath, breathing human being. It is God speaking. Don't try and put me in a box. Don't think that I'm this faith or that faith. Don't associate me with this world or that world, with this vision or that vision. I transcend all of that. And at the same time, I'm deeply embedded in all of it. It's really very simple. No two leaves are alike. No two snowflakes are alike. No two humans are alike. So how could it possibly be that there's only one path, one shot to God? And Rumi, of course, is the most eloquent of discussers of that reality, of the endless variety of trees, of leaves, of faces, of snowflakes that ultimately encompass that which has God within them. I'll add one epilogue. One of the two sponsoring entities for this evening is the Rumi Forum. Not by accident, it's named for Rumi, because the people who are associated with the Rumi Forum are of a contemporary version of Rumi thinking. The Hizmet movement, Hizmet being the Turkish word for service, is engaged in constant multicultural interfaith work, the point and purpose of which is to improve the world as opposed to control it. Mr. Swedenborg?
Now we skip a couple centuries up into what you could call mysticism for the modern age, when Swedenborg comes online. And I will just say we are so thrilled to be doing this with you because, as you will find, we celebrate the diversity of different spiritual viewpoints, as do you, and we think that there's probably never a more important time for that spiritual bridge making that's needed in the world. And I'm also struck by how mystics are perceived to be someone who's kind of out there, weird, strange, a dreamer, disconnected from reality. And what I think we see in both stories, and hopefully you'll see in Swedenborg, is that it's really about being engaged in the world, not being a part of it. So tonight is a perfect example of being engaged, and I'm really glad you're all here. Well, this last month, the show Jeopardy boiled down the biography of Swedenborg in a phrase, with this vision. With his, it says, with his nation in his name, this 18th century Stockholm-born author of Heaven and Hell used his vision to interpret Scripture. Who was Swedenborg? So that's a good start, and I could sort of wrap it up right there. That's kind of a good summary. But let me share. What I'd like to do is share a little bit about his biography, like who he was, and then a little bit of the impact that I think he had, and then some of the beliefs that are a little different. And I'll try to focus on the beliefs within Christianity that are a little different than, say, traditional Christianity. And then what I thought would be neat is to share what we're hearing as similarities, or maybe even differences, and then open it up to the audience. Does that sound like a good plan?
Sounds good.
Okay, great. So, who was Swedenborg? Just high profile. He was born in 1688. He died in 1772. He really is a product of the Enlightenment. He straddled the worlds of science, and he was truly a Renaissance man. Through his life, he had an increasing deeper and deeper Christian faith, and he really did seek to unite the worlds of science and faith. But in his younger years, he has really focused more on science And in fact, in that Enlightenment spirit, he really was seeking in his scientific research, where's the soul? If science can teach us everything, the soul must be located somewhere in the body. So he's approaching it from science. And then at the age of 56, he has a deep mystical experience where he says his spiritual senses were open. He's able to see heaven and hell and a world of spirits. And then, being a good scientist, he records those as a journalist. His most famous book is Heaven and Hell, and he published his books for many years anonymously and gave them away. So his insights, I will say up front, were very much rejected by the Protestant church of his day and the Catholic Church, so he was very much on the outs with them. And that hasn't really changed, as you'll see when I go through his biography. But he was the son of a Lutheran minister who later became a bishop in Sweden. He was a really bright kid. At age 11, he graduates from the University of Uppsala. He then was the Renaissance path. He travels to England, which was the seat of all great learning at that time. He then does work in geology, botany, zoology, and mechanical sciences, and then travels to both Amsterdam and Paris. When he comes back to Sweden, the king is really impressed with him, and he appoints him to the advisor of the Board of Mines. Now that does not sound like a very sexy role for a really smart person to take on, but the mines for Sweden were essentially the tech industry today. It was the economic engine of the country. You might think of it as the oil industry. So he is an advisor to the King of Sweden. And he continues really on a scientific path where he publishes a scientific journal called Daedalus Hyboreus. And in that he draws plans for a flying machine, which actually hangs in the Smithsonian. It looks kind of like someone rowing a flying saucer, but an early airplane. He draws plans for what would later become a machine gun, a plan to move a machine to move boats over dry land, and he draws the plans for a submarine. So he is that truly Renaissance man, way ahead of his time. He then is on that search inside the body and looking for the soul, and he gets into his next book, which is about the anatomy. And he looks at heart, blood, the brain, the nervous system, and he's curious where the soul fits into all this. He's looking for the connection to the physical world and the spiritual world. He knows that through research he can find it. But then he has a dramatic mystical experience, a real break in his life, where he has this visionary period where he travels to heaven and hell and describes it in great detail, and sort of ends his scientific career and begins a mystical career at the age of about 56. He dies when he's 84, so about 27 years. And in his case, he did the writing. He wrote 18 theological texts and travels into this world of spirits and describes it in great, great detail. One of the things that people who read Swedenborg are like, wow, it's like so incredibly detailed. How did he do it? And that's the mystical aspect. Some of the key things that he discovers in this path, and it's really, there's some reformation, you could say, of Christianity in his works, is he says that in the same way Jesus taught in parables, the Bible is to be read not just at a literal level, but the Bible is really a parable. There's a deeper spiritual meaning to be revealed in it, and he writes that out. So a quick example of this would be in our window on the street on 16th Street is the story of creation. Creation for Swedenborg is not a scientific story of the creation of the world. It is the 7 spiritual steps of a human being in their lifetime, evolving through these various levels. So everything is told in a deeper, almost a parable story. When he's asked about what's going on, his quote along those lines is, "I have seen, I have heard, and I have felt," describing the spiritual life. So eventually, his theological writings do get him into a little bit of trouble. The Lutheran Church of Sweden has essentially a trial, and 2 people who are teaching and writing on Swedenborg are banned from teaching. He is pretty much protected, largely because he is so close to the royal family of Sweden. But there are real questions, because he really challenges directly a lot of the views of the traditional Protestant church, which I'll get into. Maybe the most controversial thing that he said as far as Christianity was that the second coming for Christians is believed to be, for many, that Jesus will come again in a physical form and kind of condemn people who are bad, pull people out who are good, and that's coming anytime, could happen at any time. Swedenborg says, actually no, it's a spiritual reformation that will take place on earth, and that the holy city from Revelations will come into the world. And so this church, named Church of the Holy City, that's where it comes from. Our denomination's original name was Church of the New Jerusalem. The New Jerusalem meaning a new spiritual evolution will take place in the world, and we will have a deeper understanding of spirituality, and we are now living in that period. It may seem very chaotic right now, but it's a very positive vision of the future. Swedenborg himself was, in his time, perceived to be a clairvoyant. Most famously, there was a fire in a city 250 miles from Stockholm. He's at a dinner party. He gets up. He's panicked. People say, what's going on? He said, there's a fire in Stockholm right now, and it's getting very close to my house. So that's strange. And then he comes, oh, thank God, it just stopped. A couple days later, when messengers come from Stockholm, they describe the fire that he had described. That story got a lot of attention in both Sweden and Europe because it's so graphic and there were so many witnesses. Other examples of stories that spread in that time were the ambassador to Sweden's, from France, his wife, had a huge receipt that she was left with when her husband died. And she asked Swedenborg for help, and he spoke to her deceased partner, and they found the receipt. This got such attention that the Queen of Sweden actually called him in and asked him for a message from her brother, who was a Prussian prince. And they met, and he came back 3 days later with a message that he didn't share publicly, but she said, this guy's connected to the other side. Only my brother could have told him that. So that gives him a bit of a reputation. Of course, some people, you have to kind of choose, is this guy who was such a scientist now so into religion and spirituality, is he gone crazy? Has he had a breakdown? What is going on here? Why is he giving up this scientific career? Why is he talking about spiritual things? And these stories, as I said, they get him a lot of attention. They also did get him into more focus on heresy and doctrine within the church, because his viewpoints were quite different. A royal decree was ruled that his books contained errors of doctrine, but they were not heretical. And his books were banned, and those folks who were following him were forbidden from taking teaching positions. And that happened throughout Europe. So one thing that's unique about him is we're at the Swedenborgian church, clearly a church he started. No, he never started a church. One of his big things, people tried to follow him then and even be a guru, and he said, no, that is not my role. What I am saying will have an impact in the culture, regardless of the church even being created. This is the unfolding that will happen. And so he does not start a church. And he says that he will measure this by its impact. In his last days, he lived in London. There's a lot more freedom there. And he did suffer a stroke in 1771. And Charles Wesley, the founder of Methodism, says, I want to come speak to you. I've been reading your books. And he says, but it will take about, I can see you in 6 months. And Swedenborg says, no, because I will die on the 29th of the next month. And he does. So he writes that letter to Wesley, and he does on March 29th, 1772, at the age of 84. Swedenborg is considered a genius by all the programs that measure it. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy puts him at number 18 of the smartest people that ever lived. And so he is widely recognized. Interesting, the person who was number 1 on that list was Goethe, and the German writer. And Goethe said about Swedenborg, I am more willing than others to believe in a different world than the visible, and I have enough poetic potential and enough vitality to even extend my own limited identity to a Swedenborgian spiritual cosmos. So Goethe was highly influenced by Swedenborg, as were many others, and I'll share some of those. So what was there any impact? Because it was a Jeopardy question. Most people have never heard of Swedenborg. When people hear I'm a minister in a Swedenborgian church, they're like, huh? What? Today, not very well known. His impact has been quite dramatic. If you've ever heard of the phrase the New Age, right? New Age music and New Age teachings. That phrase, New Age, came from a Swedenborgian minister's sermon. The Reverend Warrenfeld Evans wrote a sermon called The New Age and Its Messenger in 1864. And that really did give birth to what we now call the New Age movement. The messenger he was talking about was Swedenborg. Another place where I feel he's been highly influential is in the group Alcoholics Anonymous, which does not credit Swedenborg and does not want to be associated with any particular sectarian religion, but it's pretty obvious for anybody who reads Swedenborg that the impact is there. Bill Wilson and Dr. Smith started it, and Bill Wilson's wife was a woman named Lois Burnham. She was the granddaughter of Reverend N.C. Burnham, a Swedenborgian scholar, and one of the founders of the Swedenborgian Academy of the New Church. And interestingly, that's in Pennsylvania. My great-grandfather was a founder with Burnham of that Swedenborg Academy back in the day. So he meets Lois. They get married at the Swedenborgian Church in Brooklyn, and he has his bouts with alcoholism, and she starts Al-Anon. But I found this really interesting. In our Swedenborg teachings, Swedenborg describes a palace of wisdom. And he talks about the steps that you must take to get into the palace of wisdom. How many steps do you think there are to get into the palace of wisdom? 12 steps. Good guess. And he says, I'll just describe it. Angels picture wisdom as magnificent and a finely decorated palace. One climbs to enter this palace by 12 steps. One can only arrive at the first step by means of the Lord's power through joining with him. And a person climbs these steps, he perceives that no one is wise from himself, but only from God. The 12 steps into the palace of wisdom signify love in union with faith, and faith in union with love. That's quite an impact. In the field of psychology, Henry James, who is more known as an author and writer, said Emanuel Swedenborg was the sanest and most far-reaching intellect this age has ever known. His trunk of books sits in the Swedenborg Library in California that he carried with him everywhere. His son, William James, who is credited with essentially founding the field of psychology, said Swedenborg is one of the most important for extrasensory influences, receptive personalities of all time. Carl Jung, we all know about Jungian psychology. I admire Swedenborg as a great scientist and a great mystic at the same time. His life and work has always been of great interest to me, and I read about his 7 fat volumes of his writings when I was a medical student. Swedenborg was a seer of unparalleled profundity, a scholar with superior intelligence. So you can see this influenced so many different areas. The field of philanthropy, Andrew Carnegie was raised Swedenborgian. In fact, he was the librarian for his church in Pittsburgh. And Swedenborg has a teachings on being useful and uses, and Carnegie refers to that he wants to be philanthropic, but to be useful, and uses that word uses. So he's impacted by it. The first abolitionist in the world, one of which was from Sweden, Karl Bernard Wadström, were Swedenborgians, and they took his teachings. One of his teachings that was very strange for Europe at that time was that people of African descent have the most intense connection to God of any race. So therefore, slavery would be absurd. And so the largest Swedenborgian church actually in the world is in South Africa. And in our own little community here in Washington, Fairfax County, does anybody know what that's named for? Lord Fairfax. Lord Fairfax was a Swedenborgian. He's considered one of the first Swedenborgians in the United States who freed all of his slaves, and one of his, the great descendants of that family, of the Fairfax, is now the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, Fairfax, who was a family probably freed through that connection. So, and the Fairfax were also founding members of this church here. In the area of interfaith, Swedenborg had a huge impact. The World Parliament of Religion in 1893 was an initiative by a Swedenborgian. And it was really the first time many Eastern religions were brought to the United States as part of the Chicago World Fair. Maybe one of the most famous Swedenborgian impact was through human rights, and that would be Helen Keller. Helen Keller preached in this church twice. and she's probably the most famous Swedenborgian. And she said, Swedenborg was my eye among the blind, an ear among the deaf, one of the noblest champions of true Christianity has ever known. And she writes so poetically. Let me continue her quote. She said, Swedenborg's message is like a rock smitten by Moses, yielding sweet streams of healing water, even an abundance of truths for those who hunger and thirst their pilgrimage through an age of materialism and selfishness. The doctrine set forth by Swedenborg bring men by a wondrous way to God's city of light. I have walked through the sunlit ways of truth. I have drunk of its sweet knowledge, and the eyes of my spirit have been opened, so that I know the joy of vision, which conquers darkness and circles in heaven. The famous Johnny Appleseed was actually a Swedenborgian missionary. He was doing both being useful, planting trees, and making a business of it, a spiritual entrepreneur, but he also handed out a tract which said good news fresh from heaven about Swedenborg, and had a huge influence in the Midwest. Ralph Waldo Emerson describes Swedenborg as the most remarkable step in the religious history of recent ages is that made by the genius of Swedenborg. One of the mastodons of literature, he is not to be measured by a whole college of ordinary scholars. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the poet, and you'll notice that he influenced artists, poets, that world much more than theologians, which is very interesting, who generally rejected Swedenborg. But Elizabeth Barrett Browning said, to my mind, the only light that has been cast on the other side, the other life, is found in Swedenborg's philosophy. It explains so much that was incomprehensible. Robert Frost, when asked, what is my philosophy, he said, it's hard to say, but I was brought up Swedenborgian. I'm not one now, but there is a good deal of that left of me. I'm a mystic. I believe in symbols. I believe in change and in changing symbols. Yet that does not take away from me the kindly contact of human beings. No, it brings me closer to them. William Butler Yeats, the Irish poet, said, it was indeed Swedenborg who affirmed for the modern world, as against the abstract reasonings of the learned, the doctrines and practices of desolate places, of shepherds and midwives, and discovered a world of spirits where there was a scenery like that on earth. William Blake actually attended the first organized Swedenborgian meeting in England, the first conference, and his book, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, was taken right from Swedenborg. Walt Whitman wrote actually an op-ed called Who is Swedenborg? And was greatly influenced by him, and said, he will probably make the deepest, broadest mark upon the religions of future ages of any man that ever walked the earth. In the art world, George Inness and John Flaxman both cite their inspiration from Swedenborg. Architecture has been highly influenced by Swedenborg. Daniel Burnham, who you may recognize, was the architect for Union Station and also the architect of the city of Chicago, was raised in the Swedenborgian church and has said that the outline of the city of Chicago is based on Swedenborg's description of the Holy City. The head of Harvard School of Design, Langford Warren, was the architect of this building that you're sitting in. From Boston, came down and did it. And he did it with a man named Paul Peltz, who after designing and building this church, was the architect of the Library of Congress. More in the modern sense, in the world of medicine, Dr. Oz, everybody knows Dr. Oz, was raised a Muslim in Turkey, and he co-authored a little pamphlet titled Mehmet Oz Finds His Teacher, about his wife Lisa introduced him to the theology of Swedenborg. Now, Dr. Oz's wife Lisa is from the Swedenborg community in Pennsylvania, and her mother, Reverend Emily Jane Lamole, is one of our fellow ministers in the Swedenborgian church with me. Oz wrote, as a physician, I seek to connect my patients with both the physical and spiritual levels, since true healing is never about curing the body, although I rarely mention him by name. Swedenborg has made that easier for me. D.T. Suzuki, the famous Japanese Zen master, said, why are you Westerners looking for Zen in Buddhism? You better turn to Swedenborg. It is he who you should read. He's your Buddha. And he actually went on to translate Swedenborg into Japanese. So I think Swedenborg said, look, I'm not starting a movement, I'm starting an impact. You can see he had a huge impact on culture in ways that really he doesn't get credit and didn't really seek credit. People ask me today, why for someone who had so much impact we don't know about. And I think one is that he didn't lead a movement. Two, like we've heard about Rumi, this statement that his statement that all faith paths are good does not bring you to church on Sunday or to a group for fear of going to hell. There's no fear factor. It's about love. And so I think some of the churches that have been successful have a certain fear factor to it, which isn't necessarily good. And I think also we're living in a very secular age where any kind of mysticism or spirit is laughed at and mocked for the scientific method. We really worship science right now. So people say, I like his science, but I don't, that other stuff, it's just very weird. So what is that other stuff? I'm going to share just some highlights because, how can you share very deeply on a theology like this? But just some of the things where he is different, primarily. And that's mainly life after death. He writes in detail what happens when we die and describes heaven and hell and a world of spirits in like a journalistic detail. Now there's a near-death movement that's taken through the culture right now. They have kind of, I think science has backed a lot of Swedenborg. The book Life After Life, maybe the first book about life after death, was for a more American modern audience, had a whole chapter on Swedenborg. But Swedenborg said every man's soul is in a spiritual body after it has cast off the material coverings which it carried in the world. So we're really spirits in a physical world for a brief period. He is Christian. He said that the Lord is God and the creator of the universe, and the human incarnation is known as Jesus Christ, who was a manifestation of God, the divine made flesh, to enable humanity to be aware of its unique relationship with God. It does not hold a belief which you'd have in traditional Christianity where Christ's whole purpose is to come and die on the cross for our sins. He believes that it was to come and increase our human capacity and perception of understanding and to understand God and grow closer to God. I mentioned the second coming, which is maybe the most controversial, that he doesn't think it's going to be a physical Jesus coming down. And we keep talking about the faith paths being good. He says the nature of heaven is to provide a place for all who lead good lives, no matter what their religion may be. So that really put him in trouble with, you can imagine, the Lutheran and the Catholic Church. And to that end, I do lead a Christian-Muslim dialogue for the National Council of Churches. And in one presentation, I said I think I'm the only Christian church where our mystic said that he saw Muslims in heaven. And he describes it, the Muslim heaven. So he's not in an abstract way saying all faith paths are good. He says there's a Muslim community, a Jewish community, all in heaven. In fact, what got him in big trouble is he said that many of the Christian leaders, bishops and popes, were in the other place preaching their ego and so forth. So that does not put him in well with them. It's interesting. He says the main reason Muslims are averse to Christians is Christians believe in three divine persons and therefore worship three gods, three creators. Swedenborg agrees with Islam on that and says that Islam was divinely allowed to reform Christian views on the Trinity, seeing three different beings. He really stresses the unity of God through the Trinity, but not three beings, and feels that Islam got that right, and the Christianity of his day got it wrong. He stresses that the purpose of our life is to be useful, and that's it. We're supposed to love each other and be useful in our activities. He says love comes into being by being useful in service to others. It's not an abstract. You can only love God to the degree that you love your neighbor, and that's only true if you're doing something. It cannot happen in a theological statement. So people ask, does he believe in hell? Well, he does. People who have intended and loved what is evil in the world and love what is evil in the other life, and then they no longer allow themselves to be led away from it. That's why people who are absorbed into evil are connected to hell. And actually, they are there in spirit. And after death, they crave above all to be where evil is. So after death, it is we, not the Lord, who casts anyone into hell. He's very inspired by angels, and you'll see in the front of our church, uniquely, the angels of Revelation instead of a cross. They're guiding us and whispering in our ear all the time. I love how you started about talking about the mysticism, and I just note that William James, as I mentioned, influenced by Swedenborg, had 4 characteristics of a mystic: ineffability, a noetic quality, transiency, and passivity. Ineffable meaning it's hard to describe, and I think that's something they both have in common. Swedenborg keeps saying, I'm seeing this, I cannot describe it for you. This is beyond, it's ineffable, it cannot be described. The noetic quality for James means that there's some knowledge given. And Swedenborg has a beautiful vision of a temple with an inscription over the door that says, Nunc licet, which in Latin means it is now permitted. And he saw that as that we are now permitted to understand the mysteries of faith, and the world will move in that direction. Transiency, Swedenborg went back and forth over 27 years into the spiritual states and back into the parliament and lived a life of usefulness, dinner parties and other things while he wrote this. In passivity, he said, in his prayer to God, make use of me of my service in any way, whatever. Instruct me, exhort me, dispose me whatever way you want, in his prayer to God. So it's very humbling. And in closing, I did talk to Lisa Oz, who's a friend, before this, because her knowledge of Islam and her knowledge of Swedenborg are really deep. And so I am giving her credit because I said, there's a lot of similarity, and she gave me some really good ones. So this is from Lisa Oz. I wish I had thought it up myself. But she says, 1, the fact they are both mystical traditions eschewing a literal interpretation of doctrine for a more direct experience of God. I love that one. The focus on the one God, as opposed to traditional Christianity where God is divided into 3 persons. 3, the purpose of religion as being a way to connect with the divine in a loving relationship. 4, the idea that relationship with God is something joyful rather than fearful. 5, the understanding that this material world is not the ultimate reality. And 6, and the acknowledgement that we are what we love. And she shared a quote from Rumi, which I'd like to read. If you want money more than anything, you'll be bought and sold. If you have a greed for food, you'll be a loaf of bread. This is the subtle truth. Whatever you love, you are. And then this quote from Swedenborg. Our love is our life itself. What our love is determines how we live, and they're everything about us as human beings. Specifically, our ruling, dominant love makes us who we are. I'll stop there.